the feet that walked the long dusty roads and the hill to the cross. How beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful is the body of Christ. How beautiful the heart that bled, that took all my sin and bore it instead. How beautiful the tender eyes that chose to forgive and never despise. How beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful is the body of Christ. And as he laid down his life, we offer this sacrifice, that we will live just as he died, willing to pay the price, willing to pay the price. How beautiful the feet that bring the sound of good news and the love of the King. How beautiful the hands that serve the wine and the bread and the children of earth. How beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful is the body of Christ. How beautiful.
Thank you, Janet and Emily. Jill and Emily. I knew your name. The beautiful song. I love that song. This morning, and for a special treat, the person sharing our message is a friend. Actually, we haven't known each other that long. Marty Pomeroy is from Framingham. I met Marty it's a year ago, I think. Used to be on a planning committee for a conference held around New England called the Go Conference, and my job was to organize the workshops for that conference. And Marty had submitted a proposal for a workshop, and I was very intrigued by it. It's related to our topic in the bulletin, Are Bible and Science Compatible? And at that time, we had one of our sons, our son Cashman, and several of our youth in the church in Lemon Leominster were kind of wrestling with what they're learning about science and how the world's created and stuff in science and what they read in the Bible, and they were having a hard time understanding how the two are compatible. Are they completely opposite? So there was causing some wrestling for them. And when I read Marty's workshop topic, it really intrigued me and thought he could do a great job answering that topic. He did in his proposal, and I knew that was something well beyond my knowledge, because I just know nothing with science and can't explain it. But, and I knew I would do worse damage with our kids than that. So Marty actually came to Leominster a year ago and presented there and did a wonderful job. And so we've got him here. He's going to share with us here, and he's going to kind of follow up what he shares this morning in the afternoon forum after worship as well. So you're invited to join us for that after. So I'd like to invite Marty Pomeroy to come up at this time. We turned it's on.
Green light showing. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe I'll just have to.
Can he use?
I can do that.
Can he use Emily's mic?
We'll keep going here. First of all, I do want to thank the ladies who just did that
Yes.
beautiful song.
Can we have you move down here maybe? And
Sure.
use,
I can use that microphone.
yeah. I'll pull you down this level. The cord won't go any farther. Or
We'll see
how about on the floor level? This will give you room. You're not tripping. There we go. We're going to move you out the back door in a minute.
Something like that. The problem with this is I can't move around. I love to move around, so this is going to be difficult. I'm going to probably hit the microphone a couple of times and that sort of thing. Just as a side note, beauty is not something any other species on this planet cares about but us. Right? Isn't that something that's different about us? If there's a deer out in the woods somewhere and the sun is coming up, the deer doesn't look up and say, "Wow," like we do. I don't know if they like music when they hear it or whatever, but beauty is something that's very unique to humans. We will talk about that a little bit more at the 11:30 discussion if you come to that. I appreciated the prayer earlier about giving thanks for the day and all that God has made. We're going to talk a little bit about that. There's different levels of appreciation for what God has done. Some people, just recognize God made it all, and that's good. And other people have questions about how it fits together. I'm one of those people that loves to dive in. I'm doing a presentation on Thursday night about glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain and ATP synthase, which is a little machine down in your mitochondria. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an astonishing machine. You cannot imagine. I was sitting at my computer earlier this week, and I was kind of, working on my presentation. I just started to weep. God intentionally created life. I'm convinced of that. It just is amazing. All right, now I'm going to keep Trish hopping here as we kind of run through some slides. Can I get the next slide, please, Trish? This was the verse that was read earlier. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. I know someone who's said that he thinks there's more atheists these days because too many people live in the city where they can't see the skies. If you can see the skies, it's a spiritual experience sometimes. Next slide, please. And then Paul says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." In other words, when someone comes before God at the end of their life, they're not going to be able to say, "I had no idea that there was a God." Supposedly, it's visible in what has been made. So why is there a conflict? How can the God who made this stuff be in conflict with the God who revealed himself through the nation of Israel and his Son? Well, the description of the message is, are science and the Bible compatible? And I will get to that in a few minutes, but I'll give you a quick answer. And the quick answer is, well, that depends. Depends on how you see science and how you see the Bible. But let's see now. Did we? Yes. Right, there is conflict. Next slide, please, Trish. But even in the church, there is some controversy. And as Rodney pointed out, that second bullet there, no idea what to do. So anyway, hopefully this will be helpful. Right? Hopefully this will be helpful this morning. Next slide, please. These are the three topics I'd like to cover in this context. Genesis, the three views of science in the Bible, and where science and faith touch. We're not going to get to the third one in this session, although I'll give you a little teaser every now and then. That we'll cover at the 11:30 discussion. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with, what is Genesis? This is kind of important. Next slide, please. Genesis was written about a people who lived at a time scholars refer to as the ancient Near East. That's a time and a place. We call it the Middle East now, but it's a time, that's what they called it, so we're going to use the scholars' term. And Abram lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, which was Babylonian, so he would have known the Babylonian stories, and he moved to Canaan, where the Sumerian stories would have been dominant. Of course, the people of Israel lived in Egypt for centuries. They would have been steeped in the Egyptian mythology. Next slide, please. There's a lot of similarities between the ancient Near Eastern stories and Genesis, which has led a lot of scholars to say the Genesis story and the Bible is just another ancient Near Eastern myth. Now, I'm going to make a point about this, okay? Next slide, please. I want to give credit to Dr. Ken Keithley, who first used this phrase in my hearing. Moses is a missionary to the Hebrews. There's a movie called The End of the Spear, which is about Jim Elliot and his companions and their attempt to reach the tribes in Ecuador back in the 50s. Jim Elliot and the other men in the group gave their lives. The natives lived with a spear. They killed each other with spears. They fought with spears all the time. And that's how Jim Elliot died. Well, when the wives of the men who died were able to finally connect with the natives and talk with them, they said, you know, God came to earth. And the natives go, okay. He let the people spear him. And the natives would say, why would anybody let someone spear them? You see, what these missionaries had done is they'd taken the ideas that were important to the people and used them to communicate the gospel to them. So that provided an opening. Now, that's what Moses is doing. Moses is taking ancient Near Eastern concepts and ideas, the chaos, water, darkness, light, naming, rest, and he is completely rewriting the story. Next slide, please. On the left-hand side here are concepts that were communicated by the ancient Near Eastern stories. For example, they're about the origins of the gods and the battles of the gods. And there's this primordial stuff that kind of precedes the gods, that they show up, and it's already there. Chaos is evil and must be defeated. There's monsters in these stories that are chaos monsters. The cosmos is from the bodies of the gods. If you've seen the Disney movie Pocahontas, there's a place where she sings, I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name, and she touches these things and they all glow. This is how the ancients thought. This is how people thought, is that it's all divine. And by the way, well, I'll come back to that. Whereas in contrast to that, in Genesis is not about the battles or the origins of the gods. It's about the origins of the cosmos and of life. The Hebrews would have noticed this. Where's the battles? And God precedes the stuff. Oh, he was there before the stuff was made. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. See, there's chaos also mentioned in the Bible, but it's not something that has to be defeated. It's something that God works to improve, to bring more order out of. But it's not a war, it's not a battle. And then the creation is distinct from God. It's from this concept in the late 1500s and 1600s that the West developed the scientific method. It's because we can study this stuff. We don't have to worry about there being spirits in the things that we might want to study, which might get angry. You don't want to anger the spirits. And of course, if it's got some kind of spirit in it, it might be capricious. It might behave differently tomorrow than it behaves today. So the concept of modern science, concept of science and natural law arose from the Bible. As Kepler stated, when we study what God has made, we are thinking his thoughts after him. It's a beautiful statement. Next slide, please, Trish. And then another important part is that in the ancient Near East, the humans were slaves. You remember how Pharaoh, when Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go out and worship," and Pharaoh says, "You're lazy," and he beat them because he gave them tasks that they couldn't even perform. But he was a god. They were just the slaves. They'll do what I tell them to do. If they die, that doesn't matter. They're just human. And in Genesis, the contrast is incredibly stark. The humans are told that they're rulers over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. They are God's vice-regents on this planet. God creates a garden for them. Adam does the naming of things. There's this pattern of work and rest that they are then commanded to follow. They are not to be worked to death. No one is to be worked to death. Next slide, please, Trish. So yeah, it looks a lot like the ancient Near Eastern stories if you look only at the similarities, but if you look at the differences, you can say, wow, this is something totally new. There's an author, Rodney Stark, has written a book called The Gifts of the Jews, and he acknowledges that many of the concepts that are foundational in Western civilization come out of the early chapters of the Bible. Next slide, please. For example, oh yes, you got it. The beginning and forward movement of time. That was not how the ancients thought. The nature of work, that it's redemptive. Science, I just mentioned science comes out of this. And the value of all human beings. These are foundational concepts of Western civilization. And you know what? Western civilization might not have these if it wasn't for the book of Genesis, quite honestly. Because that's what changed things. So I could argue from that the book of Genesis and the Bible are the most important book, just from this perspective, that has ever been written in the history of the world. Okay, I think it's really helpful to understand Genesis in a little broader context. And then in the church, we have some discussions about, well, what else does it mean? What else is it saying to us? Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about science and the Bible, the three views of science and faith that are held within the church. Next slide, please. So there's young earth creationism, progressive creationism, and evolutionary creationism. I used to call progressive creationism old earth creationism because there's some people who prefer that label, but I think progressive creation describes it a little bit better. So your bulletin says old earth, but I'm using a new term. Now, let me point out that all three of these interpretations and understandings of the relationship of science and the Bible disagree with atheist scientists, but not necessarily with science. Because after all, how can a scientist claim that a study of the natural laws of the earth could disprove the existence of the supernatural? How can you make a claim like that? That's an atheist claim, not a scientific claim. You can't rule out the supernatural by studying the natural, can you? All right, so we have young earth creationism, progressive creationism, and evolutionary creationism are the three views of science and faith held in the church. And I'm going to talk about those in a moment, but first I want to do a little bit of a sidebar. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, thank you, Trish, you're way ahead of me here even. When you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you. You guys know the Corinthian church is one of the most dysfunctional churches in the New Testament. Paul throws in a little sidebar here. He says, I believe it in part. There have to be factions among you. People are going to disagree, right? In order that, but here he gives a purpose for disagreement among us, in order that those who are genuine among you might be recognized. This word genuine is really kind of precious, no pun intended, but it comes from the financial services industry of the day, where in that day the coins were softer and people used to kind of like file the edges, get a little coin dust. There was a black market for, coin dust because it was a precious metal. Coins that were the correct weight were called genuine. The Greek word that's used here, those were used of coins that are the correct weight. But more importantly in this context, they were used of money changers who would only use coins of the correct weight. They had integrity. They understood the different currencies and how to exchange them, and they would only do so fairly. That's a very interesting concept that Paul is trying to pull out in this passage. It's not about being right. It's about being genuine. It's about being fair. It's about understanding the different currencies and knowing how they exchange. And as we talk about the different views here, none of them are without criticism. If anybody says, my view is the right view and it is without criticism, no one can criticize it, anyone who does is evil or whatever, that's just not fair. We need to know how to work this out. There's strong arguments both for and against every one of these views. And on the next slide, and Jesus said, you know, everyone will know you're my disciples if you have love for one another. And there's an awful lot of times when Christians are excluding one another. I don't like to see that. I know of, in a fairly large church in Lexington, of a progressive creationist and an evolutionary creationist who had a red-faced shouting match in public in that church. It's like, guys, come on. We've got to do better. We've got to do better. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the three views and what first of all, they agree on. The Bible is an authority in the church and in life and in practice. And they would all agree with the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. All three groups at sort of the tier 1 level are in agreement about what really matters. And if you were to ask the apostles or the folks who came up with the Nicene Creed, they say, well, as far as I can tell, all three of those groups are Christian. Okay, let's see, next slide. I think I'm putting these up again. Young Earth creationism, progressive creationism, and evolutionary creationism. Let's now talk first about young Earth creationism. Young Earth creationists feel that the Bible trumps modern scientific explanations. And they go to Genesis chapter 1 and say, those 6 days are 24-hour days. That's what the Bible says, and that's what we have to believe. Next slide, got a little Venn diagram there. Can you see the color? Okay, so what's in the yellow there is the word science, and what's around it is the Bible. And the argument from a young Earth creationist is, if what a science is telling us disagrees with what my Bible says, the science is wrong. Next slide, please. Now, looking at progressive creationists and evolutionary creationists, they would first of all agree that Genesis doesn't require that we treat those days as 24 hours. And afterwards, later on, we can talk about the arguments that they use, and I personally think it's arguable. And progressive creationists and evolutionary creationists would say that God gave us 2 books. He gave us the book of creation because we can read about him in that. This is a concept that Augustine came up with back in the 4th century. When people of his day were illiterate, he said, well, if you can't read the Bible, why don't you just read the other book that God wrote, which theologians refer to as general revelation. God has revealed himself to everybody, generally, in what he has made. And then there's special revelation. There's the Bible. He's told us more things about himself. All right, moving on to the next view is progressive creationists. You notice that little bit of overlap in the middle. This, again, is science and the Bible. All three views, by the way, would hold that if you want to take God and put creation in there, all of creation and all of the Bible, everything fits under the umbrella of God. So this is just the relationship of science and the Bible. A progressive creationist would argue that there's some overlap, that there's some things that are talked about in the Bible that actually coincide with scientific views of life and history. And most obviously, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Is that the Big Bang? Progressive creationists would say, yeah, that's one of the overlap spots. Next slide, please. An evolutionary creationist would argue, in contrast to that down through history, we have a bad track record in the church of trying to connect science and the Bible. We don't need that. We've got Jesus, life, death, and resurrection. We have the nation of Israel and the prophets that lead up to that. We have plenty of information to convince people. And when you start talking science in the Bible, you're kind of getting off in the weeds, and you're not going to convince anybody from that. Take them to the cross. Take them to what Jesus has done for us. Take them to the resurrection. That's what an evolutionary creationist would say. Let's just not go there. Let's not try to connect science and the Bible. It doesn't seem to work very well. Next slide, please. So they would disagree. Progressive creationists and evolutionary creationists would disagree on whether the events in the Bible reflect any scientific history. And I also want to mention something about intelligent design in this three views. Next slide, please. There's one more little spot there, little blue spots in there, and you can't really read some of this. But intelligent design looks at what God has made, and as we've read, supposedly what has been made shows something of who God is. And so intelligent design is not trying to connect things back to the Bible, it's just trying to say, well, what can we determine from nature itself? What can we determine from nature itself? And there's some places where the natural laws, the way the natural laws work and the reality of what we actually have look like, you know, somebody's had a hand in this. There's been some intelligence applied here somewhere. And so that's what they're trying to argue. On to the next slide. And this is one other place where progressive creationists and evolutionary creationists would disagree on the use of intelligent design arguments. Progressive creationists often use intelligent design arguments, and evolutionary creationists would rather that they didn't. Okay, so those are the three views: young earth creationism, progressive creationism, and evolutionary creationism. And as I've mentioned, all of the views have issues, and what we are called to is to be genuine. I have spent probably almost as much time on the website of a view that I don't fully understand how they can think that way, but I spend time on their website because I want to understand how they think, and I want to be able to talk with people who hold that view and discuss it thoughtfully and caringly and you know, just be fair with them, be genuine with them. That's the idea. Now, don't get into those discussions if you're not, you know, if you don't understand them. That's okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the 11:30 discussion. All right, next slide. So we've talked about what is Genesis. We've talked about the three views of science and faith that are held in the church. And at 11:30, we're going to talk a little bit more about where science and faith touch. Next slide, please, because I'm going to give you a teaser on this, okay, for those of you who want to come. These are the 6 areas where science and faith kind of touch. The universe has a beginning, and this is another quick teaser. If you're ever talking with an atheist, we're pretty much sure that the universe had a real beginning. And in order for something that is like our universe to begin, there had to be a cause, right? And for our universe to come into existence, the cause had to be probably infinite, probably eternal, probably immaterial, because time and space and matter are part of this universe. So it had to be infinite, eternal, and immaterial. Does that sound familiar? It's certainly compatible with God. And if you're talking with an atheist and you can get them to admit that it's compatible with God, multiverse, quantum gravity, all these others are metaphysical solutions as well. Anyway, these are the areas where science and faith can actually touch. And I don't want to talk about as much about science and integrity. That's another entire area. There's questions about integrity in the whole scientific community at times. But these areas are areas, if somebody's doing organic chemistry in a laboratory, they're not really dealing with a science-faith issue. But when you look at the origins of life, I think you're touching on something to do with science and faith, and we'll talk about that later. All right, next slide. So we've talked about Genesis. Moses is a missionary to the Hebrews. We've talked about the three views of science and faith: young earth creationism, progressive creationism, and evolutionary creationism. And then at 11:30, we're going to get a little bit more into the question of where science and faith touch. All right, that's my presentation for this morning. I hope you can join us at 11:30. Thank you so much.